If you watch this video until the end, you'll know how to become fluent in Spanish faster than 99% of people. Este es el plan exacto que yo seguiría si yo quisiera aprender español con fluidez desde cero, empezando con los cognados. So you actually already know more than 1,000 words in Spanish. That's because both English and Spanish share what are called perfect cognates, words that are the same in English and Spanish. So for example, let's take a look at these three words: chocolate, internet, and manual. These words are the same in Spanish. The only difference is the pronunciation of these words. So instead of saying chocolate, we would say chocolate, chocolate. Instead of saying internet, we would say internet, internet. And instead of saying manual, we would say manual. I have an entire list of more than 500 perfect cognates in English and Spanish, which you can find inside the Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy by clicking the link in the video description. Now, the next thing we need to do if we want to learn beautiful Spanish is to focus on pronunciation. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that they can just skip over the alphabet when they first start learning Spanish. Maybe they think it's just too easy for them. But I promise you, if you just look at a few key letters, you will instantly improve your pronunciation in Spanish. What I always tell my students is that if they want to 10x their accent as fast as possible, they simply need to focus on the vowel sounds. So in English, the vowels are exactly the same. A, E, I, O, U, same in Spanish. The only difference is the pronunciation. So we would have A, E, I, O, U. I noticed that many times English speakers will elongate the sounds of the vowels. So, yo hablo. But in Spanish, it's more abrupt and it's quick. Yo hablo, okay? That sound O, right? I tell my students, it's like a chimpanzee. O, 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 okay? It's not O, it's O, hablo. So once you get the vowel sounds down, your accent is going to sound way better. A, E, I, O, U. And we have a few special letters in Spanish, like the double R, for example. Rrr. So instead of saying caro, we would say carro. Many people struggle with their R's, but all you need to do is touch that little bump at the top of your mouth. That's what we call the alveolar ridge. You're going to slightly touch it with your tongue, then you're going to move your tongue either forward or backward and blow out air slowly. So we're going to go something like this. So it's kind of about going backwards or forwards until you find the sweet spot. It's going to take some practice, but it does work. We also have the interesting combo of L and L, the doble L. So for example, in a word like pollo. Now, many people will say that the double L sounds like a J to them. However, the most common pronunciation of the double L in the Spanish-speaking world is as a Y sound. So anytime you see that double L, you can kind of think of it like a Y. Pollo. Okay, now in certain countries, in certain areas of the Spanish-speaking world, yes, it does kind of have a J sound. For example, in a place like Buenos Aires, Argentina, they might say something like pollo, which sounds much different than pollo. And a quick note on accents. If we took a look at a word like hablo versus habló, they are written exactly the same. The only difference is that in the word habló, we have an accent over the O. This totally changes the meaning of the word. Hablo means I speak, whereas habló means he spoke, or she spoke, or usted, you spoke. So when a word does not have an accent on it, the natural emphasis will fall on the second to last vowel in the word. So for example, in the word hablo, A is the second to last vowel in that word. So we have O, then we have A as the second to last vowel. So the natural emphasis falls right there on that first A, hablo. Also, there are certain words that when written have accents on them, but their pronunciation does not change. So for example, in a word like see versus see. So see without an accent means if. See with an accent means yes. They are pronounced exactly the same, but in writing, we put an accent on C to let us know that we're saying yes instead of if. And during a conversation, you'll be able to tell the difference between the two using context clues. Now, before we move on to things like vocab, grammar, speaking, and so on, I want to quickly touch on mindset. So even if you have all the tricks in the book, you know all the strategies, you know all the tactics, if you have a bad mindset, none of it matters. Think about the stories that you might be telling yourself. Are you telling yourself, I'm too old, I don't have enough time, I'm just not good at learning languages? Or are you telling yourself, hey, I can learn a language at any age. I do have time. I'm willing to make time. I am good at learning languages. Many times these little storylines in our heads dictate how successful we become. So now that we've taken a look at perfect cognates, pronunciation, and mindset, let's take a look at vocabulary. How do we learn new words and phrases so we can actually have conversations with people? Well, learning vocabulary effectively is a combination of getting lots of input through things like listening or speaking or reading, and then using flashcards to solidify that knowledge into our brains. So for example, maybe I'm listening to a podcast that I like in Spanish, I hear a couple words I'm not familiar with, I write them down, and then later I add them to a flashcard software like Anki. Anki is my favorite flashcard software because it uses what's called spaced repetition, and I'm not affiliated with them in any way. I just think it's a really excellent software. And ultimately, the way that you're going to learn more vocabulary more quickly is simply by getting more inputs and by creating more flashcards. And the cool thing about Anki is that they actually have pre-made decks. So if you don't want to go in and create tons of flashcards, you can just look at all the pre-made decks that they have for Spanish and study the one that you find is the most effective. And if digital flashcards aren't your thing, no worries, you can just create physical flashcards. That's what I did in school and it worked fine. Now let's take a look at the grammar. When a lot of people hear the word grammar, they get scared, they run away, and they say, Nate, I heard online that I don't need grammar and I'm just gonna skip over it because I'm just gonna go and I'm just gonna speak people and I'm gonna learn that way. But the reality is you are shooting yourself in the foot if you skip grammar in Spanish. That's because you could just take 5 to 10 minutes to learn a simple grammar concept in Spanish that will ultimately save you hours upon hours of your time. So let's take a look at 4 of the most important parts of grammar in Spanish: the informal future, the preterite versus imperfect, object pronouns, and the subjunctive. So what is the informal future? Well, this is how we speak 90 to 95% of the time in Latin America in the future tense. And it's extremely simple. All you need to do is this little formula: ir plus a plus an infinitive verb. So ir means to go, and this is an infinitive verb, meaning it has not been conjugated yet. I like to teach students that the infinitive verb is kind of like a potato, and then when you conjugate it, you turn it into French fries. So if we conjugate the verb ir into the present tense, it will be yo voy, tú vas, él, ella, usted va, nosotros vamos, ellos, ellas, ustedes van. We're not going to cover vosotros in this video, which is only used in Spain. So now that we've conjugated ir into the present tense, we'll combine it with a, which is a preposition just meaning to, and then we will plug in any infinitive verb we want. So a verb like hablar, or comer, or vivir. So for example, voy a comer. I am going to eat. Vas a hablar. You are going to speak. Vamos a vivir. We are going to live. So this is what I mean by it is so important to not skip grammar, because now in less than 5 minutes, you have learned how to form the informal future. And I promise you, this is really how we speak in the future tense in Spanish 90 to 95% of the time. Ir plus a plus infinitive. That is it. Now, what about the preterite versus imperfect? Arguably one of the trickiest things for Spanish learning students. Well, here is the very quick explanation. The preterite is used for one-time actions in the past, whereas the imperfect is used for ongoing actions in the past. So, for example, with the preterite, which is a one-time action, let's say we have the word hablé. meaning I spoke. I spoke is a one-time action, whereas yo hablaba is an ongoing action. I used to speak, or I was speaking, or even I would speak. And that's the tricky thing about the imperfect. It could take on many translations into English. So hablaba could mean I used to speak, I was speaking, or I would speak, all depending on the context of the sentence. So for example, yo hablaba mientras ella cocinaba. So in this case, it wouldn't make sense to say I used to speak while she was cooking. I suppose it might work, but it sounds a little bit odd. If I were to say something like yo hablaba mucho cuando era niño, now it makes sense to use the translation of used to. So I used to speak a lot when I was a kid. That's why I say the number one most important thing to remember is that the preterite is for one-time actions in the past, whereas the imperfect is for ongoing actions in the past. If you'd like entire conjugation tables for the preterite versus imperfect, you can click the link in the video description, and when you join our Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy, you get access to every conjugation table you need. Now let's take a look at object pronouns. These are tiny words that replace bigger words. So, for example, if I keep saying the word el refrigerador, that's a mouthful. I don't want to keep saying that. So what I can do is I can replace it with an object pronoun. So I could turn el refrigerador into lo. Now, the most common object pronouns that students struggle with are the ones like lo and la, los and las, and also le and les. So you can think of lo and la as it, and los and las as them. When it comes to le and les, which are indirect object pronouns, these represent people. So, for example, if I'm talking about a cake, el pastel, I could say something like lo quiero. I want it. Lo is representing the cake. Now, I can't just randomly say lo quiero without any prior context. If I were to just randomly say to you, lo quiero, you'd be like, what do you want? I have no idea what you're talking about. So if we had been talking about a cake, oh, I love cake. Cake is so great. And then I could say, lo quiero, I want it. I understand that I'm talking about cake, or in this case, it. Now, if we're speaking about a person, like let's say we're talking about Vanessa, right? I don't want to have to keep saying the name Vanessa over and over again. So I can turn Vanessa into le. So for example, let's say I wanted to say, I told her the story. I could say, le conté la historia. In this case, le is representing Vanessa. And like I just said, I need to have already mentioned Vanessa in order to use le, because otherwise, if I were to just say, le conté la historia, you would have no idea who le is representing. That's why sometimes when we have been talking about lots of different people and objects during a conversation, it's common that we'll add something like a Vanessa to the end of our sentence. So I could say, le conté la historia, which is fine, just meaning I told her the story. But I could also say, le conté la historia a Vanessa, so that you, as the person listening to me, has extra context. So just think, lo and la mean it and are used for objects. Same thing with los and las, meaning them, used for objects. And le and les are used for people. So something like her or them. Now, we can also use direct object pronouns, things like lo and la, when talking about people. However, it is less common because typically when we're speaking Spanish, our sentences have many objects and people in them. An example of when we could use a direct object pronoun to talk about a person is in the sentence la quiero. So let's say I'm talking about my girlfriend. I want to say that I love her. If I'm only talking about her in the sentence, then I can just say la quiero, because she directly receives the action from the verb quiero. Okay, I know this is a lot of information. Let's take a look at one more grammatical concept in Spanish, and then we'll move on to speaking in Spanish. So let's take a look at the subjunctive in Spanish. A lot of people get scared when they hear the word subjunctive. Now, very important to understand. The subjunctive in Spanish is a mood. It is not a tense. So technically, the subjunctive can be used in the past, present, and future. The ones that students most often struggle with are the subjunctive in the present and in the past tense. So what is the subjunctive and why do we use it? Well, the subjunctive in Spanish is used to express doubt. That is the easiest explanation I can give you. Many times teachers will teach people, oh, there's this acronym where if you follow that, then you'll know when to use the subjunctive. But the reality is, when you are having a real conversation, are you going to think about that acronym, pause, and then have the conversation keep going on in front of you? No, because you're going to get lost and you're going to get confused. You need a quick rule that you can think of when you need to use the subjunctive. So my advice, think of the subjunctive and think of when to use the subjunctive when there is doubt. So for example, let's say a doctor tells you, hey, I recommend that you take this pill, right? They say, recomiendo que tomes esta pastilla, okay? I recommend you take this pill. In this case, the verb tomar, meaning to take, has been put into the present tense subjunctive mood. So we have tomes instead of tomas. The reason that we would say something like tomes instead of tomas is because it's not a guarantee that I am going to take that pill. Just because the doctor recommends that I do it doesn't mean that I actually will. There is doubt, and therefore we use the subjunctive. Or let's say I tell someone, hey, I want to dance. I could say something like, quiero que bailemos tú y yo. I want us to dance. Bailemos, in this case, would be bailemos instead of bailamos because there is doubt. Just because I want that doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen. Now, if this is confusing for you, no worries. The subjunctive mood was actually the last thing I learned when I was learning Spanish. I didn't learn it until I had been learning Spanish for about 3 to 4 years. So my recommendation is first you master something like the preterite versus the imperfect, object pronouns, speaking in the future tense, and then you can worry about the subjunctive. Okay, now we've taken a look at perfect cognates, pronunciation, mindset, vocab, and grammar, and now we're going to take a look at speaking. Okay, listen closely. The number one reason that your Spanish is not as good as you want it to be is simply because you are not speaking enough. Out of all of the students that I have ever taught, the ones who learn the fastest are simply the ones who are speaking the most. And I understand, speaking can be nerve-wracking. Maybe you're having a conversation, you freeze up, you forget important vocab, and then afterwards you're like, dude, I knew that. Why did I forget that? So I understand, it can be normal and scary. But the reality is, fluency is behind having conversations with people. But what if you have no one to speak Spanish with? Well, there are many incredible online resources that are free and paid. So my favorite free ones are apps like Tandem and HelloTalk. These are online language exchanges where you can speak with people for free. Sometimes they can be hit or miss. Sometimes they're kind of weird people on there. But for the most part, they're really, really good. Message lots of people and you will find a couple who are great, who want to help you improve your Spanish. Another free option in the modern world is to use AI. So speaking with something like ChatGPT or Claude. And of course, you can use a paid option, something like italki or Preply or Lengua or our Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy. All of these I've linked down below in the description. So my advice to you when it comes to speaking Spanish is to just do it. Think of Nike, okay? You really just gotta jump in head first. Don't be afraid, okay? If you're holding yourself back because you think, oh, I just don't know enough vocab, or I just don't know how to formulate sentences, or I can't understand people, or I freeze up, you just need to jump in and do it. I'm so glad that when I first started learning Spanish, I just immediately started speaking with the friends that I had who spoke Spanish because they helped me a lot. I would learn certain things in class, but there were certain things that I didn't understand or I had questions about. So I would go to my Spanish-speaking friends and I would say, hey, let's practice. And then, something would come up and I would say, wait, but why are you saying lo que instead of que? That doesn't make sense. And then I would go back to my class, ask my teacher. So speak, speak, speak. Next, we need to focus on listening. So you may have heard of something called comprehensible input, which is essentially listening to things that are slightly above your current level. And you might not know what your current level is, and that's totally fine. my recommendation is that you just start listening to things that you enjoy listening to in Spanish. So that could be, listening to podcasts, listening to music that you like, watching YouTube videos and listening to that in Spanish. And this is going to help you a ton. But I do want to say something. A lot of people take on this extreme point of view that, I'm just going to focus on this comprehensible input method. And I think it's a big mistake to do that. Because a lot of these people will do that, they will spend hours upon hours upon hours of getting comprehensible inputs, but then they won't do things like speaking or reading or writing. So then when they go to try to have a real conversation with someone, what happens? They can't say anything. They can maybe understand people, but they can't actually speak themselves. And this is the analogy that I always like to give, which is if you go to the gym and you only work out your arms, why would you expect your legs to get huge? It's just not going to happen. Same thing with your Spanish. Think about it. Why are we learning Spanish? To have conversations with people in Spanish, to connect with people. So if you're avoiding that because you're scared or afraid, which I understand, it's normal, but if you're avoiding that, then that part of your Spanish is not going to be good, or it's going to be, much worse than something like your listening comprehension abilities. So make sure that your workouts are full body, right? So you need to be focusing on some grammar and some speaking and some listening and some reading and writing, which is what we're going to take a look at now. So for reading things in Spanish, you have many options. You can read short articles in Spanish. You can read text messages from friends in Spanish. You can read posts from an online group in Spanish. And obviously, you can read books in Spanish. You can read short stories in Spanish, which inside our Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy, we have a ton of short stories in Spanish that come with audio files as well. And for writing, you can physically write things in Spanish, or you can text friends or text people online. I find that nowadays this is the most common way to practice your writing in Spanish. And I think something that's super useful is having a Spanish keyboard on your phone or computer so that when you go to type something to a friend or a family member, it will correct you if you wrote it wrong, which is a great way to learn. Now, what about apps? A lot of people use apps to learn Spanish, but do they work? Well, yes, apps are fantastic for learning Spanish, but many times students have too many apps. In my opinion, these are some of the only apps that you should have. SpanishDictionary.com, fantastic translator and totally free. Anki for flashcards. Something like Tandem or HelloTalk for speaking practice. Something like Spotify to practice listening. And a hot take for you is something like Duolingo. Now, Duolingo is not going to make you fluent in Spanish, but they've done an excellent job at keeping students consistent. And arguably, the number one reason that people fail when it comes to learning Spanish is simply because they are not consistent enough. So, as a self-learner, I have to be honest, it can be hard to become fluent in Spanish. Many times because it can be overwhelming. There's so much information out there, there's so many resources. How do you know what to do and when to do it? Many students will get overwhelmed by this and they will just give up, which is why I recommend that you get a teacher or a guide that can guide you along the way and reassure you that, hey, you're doing everything right, you just need to keep going and be patient. So you can do this through a platform like italki, Preply, or Lengua, or you can join an online Spanish learning community like our Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy, where you can chat one-on-one with me, see other people getting real wins in the world so that you're motivated and that you will stay consistent with your learning. And even if you have the perfect routine, the perfect method, the perfect strategy, it won't matter if you aren't being consistent with your learning. So remember that consistency, not intensity, creates your success. Focus on good habits, have fun, teach people along the way as you're learning, and be patient. Enjoy the process, relax, go slow. So here's a quick daily plan that you can follow to become fluent in Spanish faster than most people. Do one grammar lesson a day, plus a worksheet, so this could be anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. Speak Spanish, you can do this for 5 to 30 minutes. Listen to Spanish for 5 to 30 minutes, and then study and review up to 25 flashcards, so spending anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes as well. And that's a really simple plan that can help you learn quickly. Now, I want to give you a quick demo inside our Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy. Hola, ¿cómo estás? Welcome to the Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy. When you first join the program, you're going to see the Community tab. This is where we all talk to each other, and it is a very encouraging and supportive space. I highly recommend that you click on this little tab right here. It says Wins. This is where you can see your peers getting real world results. So people having conversations in the real world. It's very encouraging and I highly recommend you check it out. After you check out the community tab, go ahead and take a click here on the classroom tab. This is where you're going to get all of the learning materials. So when you first join, click on this Start Here tab. Our goal is to help you have a conversation within 3 days of joining the program. It's going to be basic, but it is going to be a quick win for you. Then I recommend that you focus on these 4 main courses: the grammar course, speaking course, listening course, and of course our flashcards course. Everything else that you see is going to be bonus material, and I really don't want you to feel overwhelmed or confused. If you are feeling overwhelmed, just focus on this one grammar course. These are our main video lessons. Now, in addition to our 4 main courses, we also have things like bonus resources, so my favorite apps, podcasts, movies, shows, and so on, recordings of our past live events, our podcast membership, and other niche courses, things like our Mexican Spanish Pro course and our Spanish for Travelers course. It's very cool, and I recommend that you take a look around. If you feel overwhelmed or confused by any of this, please just click on this little chat bubble right here, and you can send me an instant direct message. It's very valuable, and I recommend that you take advantage of this because it's basically like having my personal cell phone number. I'm inside the community every day helping people, so I highly recommend that you take advantage of that. Next, take a look at the calendar. So once a week, we have a live conversation class with a native Spanish speaker. Her name is Claudia, and she is very, very awesome. I also do a once a month live Q&A call. And if you can't make these, don't worry, because like I said, I post a live recording of all of these inside the classroom. We also have leaderboards, so this is pretty fun. Of course, I had to name these with fun names. So if you're level 1, you're tortilla, then we have salsa, guacamole, so on and so forth. Welcome to the community. I'm really glad you're here. Like I said, if you have questions, comments, concerns, please just send me a quick direct message here, or you can make a quick post inside the community asking us for help. Bienvenido, bienvenida. Muchas gracias.